I guess a lot of you in the room will think back, when you hear TIVO, think back to 1999 and the launch of the first commercially viable DVR, or digital video recorder. We fundamentally changed television viewing when we launched that device back then. A lot of you remember I used to go in the living room and you'd see people with those flashing 4 little zeros and then the panic on their face as they realised when they wanted to record something, have I got any space on this tape? Do I need to rewind it? Have I got anything? And just being able to click the button on your remote control to be able to pause, rewind, and record started to set up some of where we are now in video with being able to do things like be able to binge watch. Really started to get to some of these behaviours. So today TIVO is a company that's much wider than just a DVR. So last year we brought together 2 entertainment tech companies, which was Rovi and TIVO, and put them together to give a company that provides solutions to media entertainment space right across from the rich metadata that you need that describes what programs are through search, recommendation, conversation, and right the way through the guidance experience, and then a lot of analytics on the back end using the information that comes back over people's return path to actually help them drive their businesses. But just going back to set where we kind of have got to today. Back in the 50s, obviously, when TV started, it was a very, there was only 1 or 2 channels. It's kind of a family event. You kind of get all your information from a listings magazine. And then over time, actually, what's happened is we've moved through the various different stages that we've had. So we've gone through the kind of first stages into the kind of multi-channel distribution over satellite in the analog world, and then through into the digital world of this, to where we are today, which is multiple people watching multiple pieces of content on multiple devices in multiple places. And what does that actually give us? Well, it ends up, if you're looking for content, being a kind of scavenger hunt. You've got that sea of apps, you've got those multiple screens, you've got hundreds of channels, you've got stacks of devices, and then operators around the world are giving you all these other options as well. Things, skinny bundles, you've got all the streaming guys doing these originals, you've got people going a la carte, and you've got TV everywhere. And quite often what that gives you is something that looks a bit like this in your house. This is actually taken photos from one of our research programs, and we go into people's houses and we see things like this. And I'm sure actually there's probably a few people who've got sets that look like this, but actually that's not where we need to be. We need to be something, and especially if you're looking at the man on the street, the consumer, something that's really much more simple than that. The future has got to definitely be better than this kind of stuck together with sticky tape. So one of the things that we do at TIVO is actually we take a great pride in the companies leading up to TIVO as well, is actually around our research programs and trying to understand the consumer. Because being able to understand the consumer helps us to be able to provide those solutions. And we do that around the world. So every year we run a big global survey, and then also every quarter we run a study in North America as well against a pay TV panel. And so just to introduce, I just wanted a few of the things over the last few years that we've discovered that are kind of coming into place now. First one's around the image here. Well, first of all, we all have multiple personas when we watch video content. And we generally have 3. So we generally have the content that we'll watch by ourselves. We'll have content that we'll watch with our significant other, and then we'll have content that we'll watch as a group. Which means that actually it makes for very interesting different scenarios that we have to provide for. So some of the other things that we found over the last few years that are quite interesting. Well, the first one was back in 2011. We really started to see something coming out around what we called content infidelity. So this was around, and back then 88% of people said that if you watched in that middle group of that middle persona, if you watched that content that you watched with your significant other, your partner, without them, then it felt like you were being cheated on. Interestingly, this year, Netflix actually put out some more research around this. And they were saying that they found when they surveyed their base, 46% of people do actually cheat. 45% of those won't confess to it, and 61% would actually do it more if they felt they could get away with it more. And 81% should. But the really staggering one is that 14% of their respondents to the Netflix survey actually said that it was worse to cheat on content than it was to cheat physically, which is just shocking sometimes. The other things we've done is around the amount of time people spend consuming video content, and what we really see is that actually streaming and video content. When we talk about video content, obviously we hear a lot about kind of like the death of linear and that kind of thing. Actually, what we tend to do is kind of put video content together, irrespective of where it comes from, and that market is growing. But people spend as much time doing that as they do either sleeping or working. Sometimes when we look at it, wonder how they get to eat and that kind of stuff. But it is really important part of people's daily priority. The other one was around actually where people consume content now. So actually it's not just in the home in one room. We all know that. It's multiple places, multiple devices. And lots of people are streaming outside of the house. And in the survey, 2015-16 survey, 60% of the respondents were saying that they frequently streamed either in their car or the public transport. Hopefully that's skewed towards public transport and not too many people driving and streaming, but you never know sometimes. And then, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a little bit later on, something called show dumping as well, which is where people are stopping watching the programs they love. So just kind of high level, and that piece around watching video. Well, pretty much on average around the world, people spend somewhere around about 4 hours. Obviously, it differs per market. And they also spend around about 20 odd minutes searching for content every day. Actually, just in our latest US survey, we saw that just shy of 90% of people say they watch live TV on a daily basis. Which is interesting when you hear all these headlines of linears going down. 67.5% will use their DVR on a daily basis, and 63% will use will use an OTT or a streaming service. So what's interesting there is actually we're starting to see those streaming services actually getting up to the same kind of levels as people using their DVR. But what it clearly says is people want their content on their terms. It's similar here actually in the UK. There was a YouGov study just recently, their broadcaster narrowcast report, where people are watching between 2006 and 2016, actually it went from 251 minutes to 231 minutes of linear. So it was down a little bit, but it's pretty much holding up. But video content is definitely important. The other areas around which I talked a bit about before as well was around that kind of cross-platform viewing. And what we see is that well over 50% of people are actually now taking one of the subscription services. What we generally see as well is there's obviously this talk about kind of cord cutting. What we see a lot of though actually is either cord shaving or cord supplementing. Not necessarily, especially in the markets outside of the US. There's obviously a lot of what's driven in the US is driven by the exceedingly high cost of pay TV. But in some of the other markets, actually, it's much more supplemental. People aren't cutting completely. What we have seen, and there was an Ampere analysis study earlier in the year, was that 39% of people across their survey base had both pay TV and SVOD, compared to only 30 who had pay TV and only 13 who had only SVOD. So it was very much pointing towards actually people are having to take multiple services. And especially when you look around kind of where exclusive content sits, because actually there's very little content that sits across all of the services, and a lot of people have got those kind of exclusives. Another interesting one around is kind of around the demographics and what we see, the kind of differences in the different age groups and different behaviours, and there's a little bit more on this in a minute. But that group, that what's termed that millennial group, so the group that's grown up, and I guess I can see there's a few in the room, but have grown up with mobile phones, have grown up with the internet, actually are over-indexing on a lot of the things that we measure. So they're spending more time watching content, consequently spending more time searching for content, they have more propensity to actually be a subscriber to one of the new services as well, and also looking for kind of having a simpler experience as well. So on that, and I just mentioned it before, the show dumping. So this is something we covered last year. Was actually people will love a show and they'll invest an awful lot of time in it. So the Breaking Bads, the Game of Thrones, those really high value, high quality content. But if you make it too difficult for them to watch it, they'll stop watching it. And a lot of the reasons why they stop watching it is around if it moves from one service to another, or if it becomes moves to behind a paywall, a different kind of it becomes a different cost or a different business model to get it. And actually about just over a third of people, so 37%. In the millennial group, actually that's even more. It's over half of them have said they've stopped watching one of the shows because of that. A kind of another interesting bit around kind of discovery, and this is kind of self-fulfilling. If you offer a really good service, then people will watch more content. But it's nice to actually see that the figures actually prove what should be obvious. And actually it becomes, if you've got services where people consistently recommend, say it's better than 7 out of 10 actually, it's significantly more content that people will watch, which is good. And then this year in the study, actually what we looked at and what we saw across the global study was actually we're starting to see kind of two groups of people emerging, and their behaviours are quite different. So what we found was actually there was a real grouping around people who've had their services for 4 years or more, and then people who've had service for less than a year. And we kind of fun name them long-term loyalists and the fickle newbies. And what we saw was those different behaviours, but across the board actually, one thing is people, they're paying good money, so they expect something a lot of the time better than what they think they're getting. A lot of people, 38% will actually say they've turned their device off because they can't find something to watch. And if we think about it, and I think one of the panelists said earlier, we used to have a service in video that was super simple. We've taken as an industry, made something really, really complicated. And we're trying to get back to making it more simple again, because we've given everybody all this access to all this content. There's no way that they shouldn't be able to find something to watch, because there is almost ubiquitous access across in many places. But at the same time, they also think that it should be it really should be easier, and half of people say that. And also, some of them, a quarter of them, are actually willing to pay more to be able to get to that point of having something that makes them get back to that simple discovery experience. When we look across those groups, actually as well, those two ones, in those newbies are more likely to want to move or churn off of their service. I think what we're starting to see there is we're starting to see those people who have been loyal to their service are staying with their service, and you've got the group who are moving are the ones who are constantly churning from one to the next, always looking for the best deal or the best service. The other thing we see as well is around kind of that OTT space, and we saw that earlier on as well, was that actually it's more popular with those people who are moving, and a lot of that's down to the fact that those services are a lot more flexible as well. I think what there is there's a risk here, obviously, of the traditional kind of pay TV, those people seeing it as kind of an antiquated service. And not as hip or as flexible as some of the newer options that are around. The one area though where we're really seeing change, and one of the areas where actually this is kind of really is kind of we're getting to the new technology piece and how we help people is around voice technology. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into that and talk about that. What we see across all of our lives is voice assistants becoming part of almost everything we do. And obviously we've seen a huge push this year from people like Amazon and Google. Amazon have just released the next 6-7 devices in the Echo range. Pretty much they want to be doing having Alexa do everything for you. But you get the smart assistants across your smartphone, your speaker, your desktop, more and more into vehicles. You've got the fun things like robots and toys, and then we've got the kind of the entertainment and TV systems, which is the kind of the interesting place for us. It's already playing a really important role in internet search. 20% of mobile search queries on Google are made by voice. Actually, that figure's now a little bit old. It's from last year. So that's going to be significantly higher, I would imagine. I saw some stuff yesterday where actually was, and especially the younger generation, actually a lot more at speaking to their devices. Similarly on Bing, 25%. Then if you look at people like ComScore predicting that in 3 years' time, actually half of all internet searches are going to be driven by voice. And if you think about that, when you think that this year alone, Google handled 2 trillion queries, that's a lot of spoken interaction. Also, they are pretty prevalent now. So around 6.5 million people in the US are going to use a voice-enabled digital assistant at least monthly this year. It's about getting on for 20% of the population, which is quite high. And that's just going to continue to grow and grow as these devices become more and more part of people's everyday lives. I think what's really interesting here, though, as well, is actually the change in the interaction with devices that's bringing. So the last 60 years or so, we've been kind of adapting to computers and kind of moulding around how computers work. Going forwards, it's much more around computers learning how we are and adapting to us. And that voice is a huge part of that revolution. So the other thing, and there is how people use these devices. Well, where people use voice most at the moment is within the smart speaker space. That's kind of obvious. It's kind of the use case that we've given people. But they're using them predominantly the most usage is around several times a week. It's actually slightly less frequently on phones. Which is interesting given a phone's a device that was originally designed to speak into. It's amazing how many phones don't actually get spoken into. But people are using them in there as well. When we look at our own studies, we see that people who've got access to a voice-enabled remote, so something like if you've got Sky Q and you've got the remote control that we work with them on, 60% of people are using it frequently or daily. Similarly, on the speaker side, it's over 60 again. If you've got a voice-enabled video app, so that's an app on a mobile that's actually got a voice capability within it, again, around about 60% of people saying they're using it frequently or daily, and similar numbers again with the kind of wearables. What there is, though, is there's this problem that actually a lot of the time, and the use case just doesn't add up. So after a couple of weeks, almost all of the skills are not being used anymore. And what's really interesting here is actually what we need to look for is what are those cases that make sense. It's great to get one of these devices, but do you really, are you going to really be changing your heating every single day? Are you going to be doing the shopping on it every single day? Probably not, but entertainment and video is one place that really does make sense. And whether that's saying something like to Alexa, play me some soccer music from Trinidad, or what's the weather? There's those pieces that do. And we're seeing that already as well when we look at how people are using them. So entertainment really is the top thing that people do. So on smartphones, the number one thing people do is play music before they start to do some of those more functional things. Even more so in the smart speaker space is playing music and books and getting books read out to them. What we see in the TV space and is round about in the latest set of results from our quarterly survey, is people using, just under 11% of people who've got access to the remote are using it on a daily basis. I think what's really interesting here as well, though, is actually looking at how people use it. So what we've done is we measured across the last 10 months on one of the US services that we work on as to what type of queries people were making. And so, well, predominantly it's people are picking up and going the name of the show, so EastEnders, Bake Off, or going take me to BBC One, take me to Sky Atlantic. What we're starting to see the movement towards having a much more expansive query. And what we'd call a conversational query. So at the moment it only sits around about 4%, but we expect as people become educated to see that really grow. The other area as well is actually the number of uses that people are doing. So we see around about 31% of people are doing kind of 4 to 7 searches a week, and just shy of 17 are doing 8 to 11. Both of those are kind of in the range of 7% increase quarter on quarter. So once people start to use these services, actually we'll see them continue to use them. And a big part of that is actually to do with things like the error rate has fallen and come down. So if you think back to even just a year ago, error rate sat at about 8.5%. By May this year, that was down to kind of 4.9%. There's some studies by Microsoft that reckon that human error rate is somewhere around about 5.1. So actually we're getting to the point where the computers are better at understanding us than we are ourselves. Although you have to take that with kind of a little bit of pinch of salt, because that's kind of like at the very top level. It doesn't really account for things like regional accents, speaking styles and languages where any kind of limited training data is available. So that might be good for kind of mainstream Queen's English. But if I'm back home and someone says, "Is that a canny film?" It's not going to have quite the same the same level of understanding. The other thing that voice does as well is actually changes kind of the level of intent of what people are asking, and you have to be able to understand what people are saying, and then that translates into kind of how far down the tree they want to go. And so, and from a content discovery point of view, gives you a kind of indication of where they are on the kind of that path to content. And what's really interesting is when you kind of look at the queries as well, is we've spent a long time trying to narrow down queries because we've trained ourselves into typing into Google, and we want to type a query in as fewer keywords as possible. You give someone the ability to express themselves, actually they start to use more words again, and also start to kind of change what they're asking for. So an example, like if you said, what's the best brunch in Los Angeles? Are you asking for what's the best restaurant that serves brunch in Los Angeles, just in general? Or are you asking for where can I go right now for brunch in LA? So you've got a kind of nuances within it, and it's the same in the entertainment discovery space. If somebody's saying, asking for a particular program, what is their intent? And what we found is actually it's almost 100% of it is implied from me. So in the entertainment space, when I say, what's on TV tonight? I'm not asking for the Radio Times. I'm not asking for a grid of listings that's just generic. Actually, I'm asking what's on TV for me tonight. And it's similarly, if I said find me movies with Tom Hanks, I don't want all the movies with Tom Hanks. I want the ones that I liked, because some of them I'm not going to like. So it really changes entertainment discovery. And I think looking forward into the future, over the next 3 or 4 years, as we move towards having completely personalised experiences, is going to form a huge part of that process. Going to play a little short video now that actually demonstrates some of the way that voice can be used in the interaction experience. It's taken from our one of our Android TV interfaces and gives you a kind of a little bit of flavour of some of it. Julian's probably seen it quite a few times before. Let's start with something simple. What's on TV right now? So we get back a list of shows that are tailored to us but available on TV now. I want to watch some NBA basketball. So here I'm changing the context, changing into sports, and getting back a list of the basketball games that are on. What's the movie with Russell Crowe where he won an Oscar? So here we're going a little bit more specific, asking for an actor and asking for the film where he won an award and getting back the results of Gladiator. I want to watch an action movie on Friday night. So here we're getting a bit more specific about time, asking to what's coming back and available on Friday night. What's the movie where Ben Stiller plays a male model? So here looking for a particular actor and looking for the role that they played. Show me some films about the financial crisis. So here we're taking something a little bit more abstract like the financial crisis that's not generally available within the metadata around a movie, and packaging that up and bringing back the list of films that relate to the financial crisis. I want to watch a James Bond film without Sean Connery. So here we're looking at using a negative and taking a specific actor out of a film from a series of films where we've had multiple actors play the same role. What's the movie with Eddie Murphy where he plays multiple roles? So here again an example of taking an actor who's played multiple roles within a specific movie and bringing back those results. Show me some movies filmed in space. So looking for space movies and getting back the results again. What's the movie that features the BMW headquarters? So here what we've done, we're looking for something that's not necessarily contained within the traditional metadata about the program. The fact that Rollerball was filmed at the BMW headquarters. I am your father, Luke. We're talking about Luke Skywalker, and we get back the specific movie where that line came from. So I think what you see there is you see kind of a glimpse into some of where, and this is actually quite close in the future. It's not too, I mean, some services are already, you're already able to do this kind of stuff. So if you look at Sky Q, you can do this. What we're starting to see though is kind of, we think kind of 5 key trends that are going to change the TV market over the next few years. And actually behind all of this is a huge amount of artificial intelligence and machine learning right across the board. You saw in that video some of the times where the speech to text wasn't necessarily completely accurate. So we do a lot of work to be able to understand and take inference from the words that are there to think actually you meant this rather than that in that case. But the kind of 5 things that are really going to drive it is A is around personalisation. We see it more and more across all sorts of areas, but in the entertainment space, that being able to get to that content, that's the content that's relevant for you, is really important. I think you see there's people, TDG put out a survey or a report saying that by 2025, essentially all video guidance is going to be 100% recommendation based. I think some of us are going to get there well before that. Voice is going to be a huge factor. It's really come on, really driven by the kind of the Amazons and the Googles of the world over the last 12 months, and will continue to be done. I think certainly in the pay TV space, it's very much now a have to have, especially at the top end of the services. If you're an operator, you can't get away without it being in that bill of materials. Being visually rich obviously is important. There's a lot going on in and around actually being able to deliver, and it comes back to the personalisation. Having a different visual representation for pieces of content for different people. So if you have a particular film where a particular actor you like, actually having that image with that actor feature in the guide rather than a generic image of the film without that actor, we'll see a lot of that. Obviously the move into IP is making a huge difference. and then being more and more flexible. So actually consumers expecting to be able to get an experience across multiple devices and be able to get it on their terms when they want it. And finally, one thing that we should never forget, there's three kind of things that are really important around video. So the one is obviously the content. Without great video content, actually there's no video industry. We're really lucky over the last few years with some of those players coming in, pumping billions and billions of dollars into the content market. Actually it's up to the content game again. The consumer has to stay at the heart of everything. After all, it is them. But one of the most important things is around context, of being able to understand where somebody is, what they're doing, and then be able to give them the video that's right for them at that time. So that's me. Don't know if you want to do questions now. I'm going to be around for the drinks, but
a few minutes. We're doing well.
Good.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I think I learned quite a lot from that. I think voice was certainly one of the themes of IBC this year.
Yes.
You touched a little bit on demographics. You talked about millennials, Generation Z, Generation X, and so on. Something we talk about quite a lot in our industry is the migration from big screen to small screen, and whether people will migrate again when they become a little bit older and start to settle down. Do you have any thoughts on that dynamic between big screen and small screen and demographics, please?
Yes, so like you say, I mean, one thing is obviously we see when we look at the kind of younger generations, we see a lot more video consumption on smaller screen devices, and I think what we're seeing now, and obviously we're living through it, as those people become older, will they naturally migrate into that bigger screen? I think a lot of cases yes, but also there's those behaviours that they're now used to, that actually they have access to content that they like to watch. Content's being formatted to make it accessible on smaller screen devices. Will they continue to watch that? Probably yes. So actually, will they continue to move forwards? I think the other thing as well is it depends on where you are as to how big the screen gets, as to actually do you get any benefit from that screen. It's questionable sometimes with some of the things, like with the 4K. Are our houses in the UK actually big enough to benefit from it? But no, I think we'll continue to see. I don't think we'll see a complete shift back to moving away from mobile video back into big screen video. I think what we'll see is actually the younger generation continue some of those behaviours, but they will actually watch on bigger screens as well.
So it's a multi-screen future. Thank you.
No. The other thing as well is obviously is around kind of the personalisation on those devices. Small screens are very much more personal, and the big screen is much more shared experience.
I wanted to ask about voice. So obviously the two leading voice people are Amazon and Google. I know Comcast are doing their own voice. Would you see voice as a Trojan horse for Google and Amazon?
It's an interesting question because obviously you've got the bigger players are obviously doing it themselves, and a lot of that to do is with that control of the consumer and who owns the consumer. I think what we will see though is actually a lot more demand for kind of interoperability between the different devices. There won't be just one input device. And we're starting to see actually with some of our customers already. So like for instance Dish, where we do the voice tech behind, and when I say what TIVO does in the voice tech space, actually what we're doing is the interesting piece, which is the NLU on the text string. We rely on the likes of Nuance and people to do that speech to text. What we see with Dish actually is they're doing both routes. So they've got the remote control, but they've also got an Amazon skill. So you can say, Alexa, what's on Dish? Or Alexa, show me, put NBC on Dish or whatever. So that kind of, there's a demand in the consumer space, I think, to have multiple ways to use voice. It'd be interesting. I mean, obviously, the Amazon, there's going to be a huge battle for who's actually, and it's not just control of the home. Actually, it's control of your life, because the smart assistants don't just exist on a speaker, on an Echo speaker or a Google Home device. actually there's being pushed into mobile phones, they're being pushed into vehicles. It is very much that kind of who controls everything to do with your life. So
Don't be afraid, you know.
yeah.
You mentioned couples infidelity,
Yes.
but what? Shut up. But that was the interesting thing on that is couples infidelity. If it's a big portion of viewing, would indicate it's big screen because you are
Yes.
watching it together. So whilst you mentioned youngsters being on small screens, you would think as they grow old and then become a couple,
Yeah,
a
I think
lot's
it's
going to go to the big screen. But then what portion of
yeah, no,
viewing is
it's an
couples
interesting one.
infidelity?
As that, and it is that kind of those kind of viewing experiences as to maybe the drivers that bring people back into a shared screen. But equally, we see when we look at some of the young people in the studies, actually, there's two people sat on a sofa watching a laptop. It's not necessarily on a huge screen stuck on a wall. So.
Charles, thank you.